time.
Good evening and welcome to Face to Face. For the Newsfirst team, I'm Niresh Eliathambi. I'm pleased to welcome back to the program Miss Bhavani Fonseka, who is a senior researcher at the Center for Policy Alternatives. Good evening and welcome back, Bhavani.
Thank you, Niresh.
So I hear that you've been traipsing all over the upcountry and doing a lot of valuable work, getting a lot of feedback on the post-cyclone Ditwa response, especially in the area of governance. Tell us, what have you guys discovered? And it was a team from CPA, I believe, which went up there.
Yes, so Niresh, what we felt was important is to go and directly see what was the situation, especially after that was over 40 days after the disaster, and there were reports coming from the area from our partners, local contacts, that the situation in some areas were quite dire, and that assistance, there were gaps in the assistance, there were gaps in communication, the information going to people. So I felt it was very important to go and meet with people, directly speak to the affected communities, but different stakeholders. So spent a few days in the different districts in the hill country. And we wrote to the government soon after we came back, raising some urgent concerns in that there were gaps in both governance and human rights issues around the response. And I think that requires urgent, immediate attention.
Right. So when you say governance and human rights issues, would you like to give us a bit more detail there? Because I read your report and there's a lot which you found wanting.
So, Niresh, to start off with, I think the disaster, the cyclone, and the immediate after effects were devastating across the country, many areas.
It was unprecedented.
Unprecedented, and the scale of it, I think one needs to recognize it's going to take a long time to address all of that. From the northern east to the hill country to Colombo, Kolonava, and other areas, what we saw, what we heard in November, December, and January, it raises many questions. So it's not just one particular area that was affected. That's important. And I think the fact that the government and many others, your institution, individuals came out and provided support, recognized the fact that this was quite a large-scale disaster. That said, there's a lot of questions in terms of what we saw last week. And that was in terms of particular areas, especially in Nuwara Eliya and Badulla. So we went around the districts, but particular areas, some estates in Nuwara Eliya and Badulla where assistance hadn't come to these people over 40 days after the disaster. They were managing on their own or with the support of well-wishers. Now, that's a huge question in terms of why are individuals not provide a basic assistance. This is not looking at long-term. This is very immediate assistance of food, shelter, water, sanitation. So that's a question. The other one is, and we were there when there was a notice about the weather and an impending potential cyclone creating further havoc. And there was this issue which we saw firsthand, that information in Tamil, because a lot of these communities, especially the Malayalam Tamil community in these areas, need to get information in Tamil. And there were gaps in that information. There was a lot of information in Sinhala, but if people don't understand that information or it's not accessible to them, that's a problem. So in the most, I would say those are two of the main things that I saw. Gaps in assistance and lack of information and language issues that were directly requiring attention. So those are two areas that we raised with the Commissioner General, with the task force that's now been appointed, and many others in government. But there are also more structural issues we can go into. But I think one needs to recognize in the wake of the disaster, now over 40 days after, there are still communities and minorities who are not getting the assistance or the information, which raises many questions.
Right. So let's deal with the communication issue. And it seems incredible that in this day and age, with just two languages, three if you throw English in, we can't get this right. That government departments can't put out a warning, a media release, a tweet in three languages. Well, I mean, you just have to put it up on Google or whatever, some form of AI. You will get it translated, and then you just need to have a human being who knows that language to go through it to make sure it's correct, and then you send it out. What's the big deal?
I mean, I also don't understand.
Yeah. And we've seen this, I mean, not just with this communication, but I know CPA has been working on so many aspects of communication, such as you walk into a police station, and is there a constable there who can write, take a statement in Tamil, and so on. So this language issue, which was the root cause of the civil war, for goodness sake, still has not been addressed.
And I think there is this kind of, I don't know if it's lack of awareness or understanding, but language rights are in the Constitution. It's a guaranteed right for all citizens, be it Sinhala or Tamil. It should be there. It should be practiced on the day-to-day. And, we've been in court challenging this and getting some redress. But I think the cyclone showed there are so many gaps in the implementation. And it's not for the lack of trying of, community groups, media, and others who've offered their services too. And I know in these areas, some of the civil society groups have said, we will translate, get us involved in this. But there seems to be a continuing gap, and I think that needs urgent attention. And I hope from the task force to the Commissioner General, there are many entities now that have been set up, plus the media ministry and others, that really should look into what happened. And this is not just kind of something academic. This is day to day. These are people's lives one is talking about.
Right. And an emergency could crop up any day. We hope it won't happen for a long time, but it could happen tomorrow, next week, next month. So this is something which needs to be addressed quickly. And the solutions are there, aren't they? You don't need rocket science. And you have countries like India which have hundreds of different languages, and they get it right. And we've got three, and we're still struggling. Yeah. Right. So let's look at your first point. No assistance for 40 days. And I don't understand that at all, because in this country we've got how many government servants? 1.5 million, 1.7 million. So there's no lack of manpower. And wherever you go, you have layers upon layers of bureaucracy. Starts with the Gramanilari, and then you have development officers, and you've got your midwives, and then you've got your divisional secretariat staff, agriculture officers. It just goes on and on and on. So every inch of this country is covered. There's no part of the country which is not in a Gramanilari division. So how can any part of the country not have been reached for 40 days? So,
I mean, again, I would have also had many questions if I hadn't gone to the area and spoken with the people. And some of these areas, which were, I think, one of the worst hit areas in Kandy, Nuwara, Badulla, what they said is when the disaster hit end of November, in some areas, the Grama Sevaka was also MIA. I mean, they couldn't find the person. that raises questions as to what happened there. And I think that's been looked into in terms of why was there delay at that stage. Now, what we saw in some of these, particularly estates, is a question that surrounding villages around the estate got assistance, but in the estates, there were gaps. And those people we spoke to said, look, there seems to be a discrepancy because we're in the estate. And there seems to be a finger pointing that that should be done, provided by the estates and the plantation companies as opposed to the government machinery. Now, Niresh, there is a fundamental question here. It's a disaster. There is a government. There is a government that imposed emergency soon after, and we can go into that also. But there is a government that's responsible for every citizen of this country. Where they live shouldn't be the issue here. Every citizen should be the responsibility of the government. Now, I think if there's finger pointing in terms of who should be providing assistance, that's a conversation to have. But I hope at least now the government, the Commissioner General's office, that was the whole purpose of a Commissioner General, was to ensure assistance goes to the most affected, that they take cognizance of this issue, take note of the areas that are still facing challenges and provide this assistance. Now, one of the things I saw directly was not just the lack of assistance in terms of food, water, sanitation going into these areas. There are also structures that are in very precarious condition. There are cracks in these buildings. People can't stay in those. These are also school buildings. Now, there is this also concerted effort to get schools functioning again. And the question is, can students, can children be in these places which are very precarious? I mean, another heavy rain, those could collapse. I saw this for myself. So it's a question about who is ultimately responsible. It's the government, it's the state machinery. But what is the role of the estates? And estates should play a role. And then making sure, without pointing fingers saying, you are responsible, making sure the people who are affected get that assistance.
Right. And now with the estates, yes, you have the estate management companies, but that's simply another added layer. So it should actually mean that there's more support and not less. And every estate is still within a Grama Niladhari division. So the Grama Niladhari can't wash his or her
But
hands off that.
I think that raises this issue of how plantations, estates have functioned over the centuries, over the decades. And there is it's a bigger question than just the disaster response in terms of the roles and responsibilities of actors in providing services. But, you know, we're talking about a community, the Malaya Tamil, that is one of the most vulnerable and structurally faced inequalities and discrimination over the years, over the decades. And so there are particular issues. I'm sure you've had the community also come on your shows and speak to issues of language, of lack of documentation. There was a point where citizenship, a very basic right, was not with them. Land, livelihood, all of that. So it's not just that, okay, you have the estate and they should be providing, but it's a bigger question of, are these not individuals who are citizens of this country? Should not they be given the same basic services, but also be treated with dignity? What I saw in those few days, and I say only few days, there are many others who worked on this for longer, who talk about very poor living conditions. Line rooms, I mean, people don't having the basic facilities on a good day. These are the worst days. So it's a bigger question, and, you know, the present government before elections was part of conversations that culminated in something called the Hatton Declaration in 2023. There are members of parliament from the NPP, there are members of parliament from the opposition who should be really looking at this whole issue of how do you address long-standing grievances, fundamental issues. So it's both the immediate and the long term that needs to be addressed.
Right. And basically, if these issues aren't addressed urgently, we're sitting on a powder keg, aren't we? Anything could happen at any time, and we'd be found wanting. And you can blame whichever government you want to, but it's a massive failure on the part of every government. I mean, Newsfirst did an in-depth story on the tsunami warning system, which is non-existent. I mean, 77 tsunami towers and not a single one is working. And for goodness sake, it's simply a tower with a siren. The towers are there, the sirens aren't working. So how much simpler can we get? So we need to get all those things going, and it's not rocket science, is it?
Yeah,
all of this is pretty much, it's normal stuff.
Yeah, and I think the cyclone in a way showed that there is a lot of issues in terms of governance and structures that require attention. Now, as you said, with the tsunami, one of the things that came about post-tsunami was the Disaster Management, the Act, and then the center, all of that was set up. That was 20 years ago. And so the question then is that system working? If not working, why is it not working? And I think it gets to a question of capacity, expertise. And I think, it's not blaming, but it's making sure the preparedness is there to make sure we don't have to go through these kind of devastation and have that kind of impact. But at the same time, I think a question needs to be asked is, I raised before the whole issue of the state of emergency. End of November, soon after the cyclone, emergency was declared. Again, Sri Lanka has had cycles of emergency, or every government there's been emergency. I've come and spoken on this show on different states of emergency, but what we saw then also raised concerns. Why are we having a state of emergency when we should have functioning administrative systems in place to be able to respond to a cyclone, to floods, to landslides? But the kind of go-to is, let's declare a state of emergency. Now, we're in January 2026. The question is, do we still need a state of emergency? And having spent some time in these affected areas, I have a question as to, is emergency really doing the job it was meant to do? Why then are people still not getting assistance? Why are there gaps? So I would say, I hope the government and the different stakeholders take note of the fact that without just resorting to these broad paths, let's fix the problem. Let's have institutions that work. Let's have people who, with the expertise and knowledge, doing that work without just tokenistic positions and individuals in place that doesn't do anything.
Now, one thing that occurs to me, having interviewed you and many others with regard to not just cyclones, but many natural disasters over the years, one thing that occurs to me is we don't do drills. We set up institutions which are supposed to function, and then when the disaster actually hits, they are found wanting. That's because we don't actually do exercises, drills, which should include all the people down, in that chain, and even the public. We just don't test it out, do we?
Not that I'm aware of. So, again, that speaks to the whole preparation, planning. But it also, I think it's important to recognize that there, as you also said, there are different layers of government. You also have elected representatives. You have local governments. Ideally, provincial councils should be functioning, and you have another layer then that can respond to certain things. So from the Grama Sevaka to the division secretary to the GA to the Pradesh Sabas, you have different actors who all have a role to play in these settings. Unfortunately, I think the disaster, Ditwa, showed that there may be structures in place, but when it comes to an emergency, things just don't work. So it gets back to the whole point is now is the government really putting things in place to make sure that the early warning systems work. But that again, that said, I think it's also important that those people who are living in these hazardous areas are also in a place where there is safety. And this is another issue that came up when we were in the areas, is that they are being told to go to areas that are not safe, that they feel the ground is not safe. Another heavy rain, there could be another landslide. So again, difficult questions, but I think it's very important that I think this government can. I think they can do this, is really have a, without getting politics involved, do a very in-depth assessment and think about what are the areas people can go to. This whole return, resettlement, rehabilitation, relocation, it's coming up. And this whole question of even where, I heard this unfortunately, that in some of these hill countries, they're talking about building flats. That's not an area that should be having flats. Now that's asking for another disaster.
Absolutely.
So, really thinking through without just, playing politics, think about what is needed on the ground, listen to the people on the ground, but listen to the experts as well and have things in place that work.
And we need to be practical above all, isn't it? I mean, you spoke of, this news that there could be flats built. I mean, anyone who has had to evacuate from a block of flats knows it takes a long time. Whereas if it's just a 1-story or 2-story building, you're out of there within 30 seconds.
And that's assuming that area is a flat area. Now you're talking about hill country. You're talking about areas that are prone to landslides. Anyone who's gone into those areas in the last, say, 30, 40 days will know that there's still areas which look like if there's a heavy rain, it will come down. So you think you're building flats around these areas and putting those people in dangerous ways? So, I think land is a very sensitive topic across Sri Lanka. I mean, we've seen a conflict because one of the root causes is land. This is the moment where government can identify areas which, there are available areas that people can go to. But the communities need to be involved in that conversation. You can't just turn around and say, we're going to build flats and we're going to solve the problem. That's not going to solve the problem.
And it needs to be a localized solution, don't you think? Because each area is different. So, you can't just sort of have a blanket national policy. You need your national policy, but it has to take into consideration each area and the requirements and the challenges.
I know, and I think if one remembers post-tsunami, I remember there was a conversation even at that time, with the coast conservation saying, these are the buffer zones, there wasn't enough land in some areas, particularly in these. They again started saying, let's build flats. Now, flats for whom? This was a fisher community. Where are they going to keep their boats? So practically not thinking through raises many questions. Similarly, with post-disaster, post-cyclone, Ditwa, again, really thinking through what is the localized response that should be there? Who is best to decide? Who's doing the scientific studies? But in all of this, making sure the communities are part of this conversation. It's not seen as a Colombo-driven exercise with no sense of what the ground realities are.
Interesting views indeed. I am in conversation with Bhavani Fonseka of the Center for Policy Alternatives. We need to take a short break now. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
the ordinary. We wait for the
Welcome back to Face to Face. I am in conversation with Bhavani Fonseka, Senior Researcher at the Center for Policy Alternatives, CPA. Bhavani, let's move on to one of your pet areas, which is legal reform. And you've been talking about legal reform for a very, very long time, and you're an absolute expert on it. And there are a lot of areas which need reform. We know this because the entire legal system has broken down over the decades. I mean, you can start with the courts, you can start with the police, and whatever, but when it comes to legislation, there are a lot of areas which need urgent attention. So let's start with the Prevention of Terrorism Act, that amazing piece of emergency legislation or temporary legislation which we've been living with since 1979, almost as old as I am. That's saying something, right? And now we know that this is going to be repealed, and it's going to be replaced with another piece of legislation. So let's have your thoughts on that.
So one of the things, as you said, PTA has been in the books for several decades, and in a way it's become now normalized. I think a lot of people are like, oh, PTA, whatever. And it wasn't such an issue in a way in the South, as opposed to, I think, minorities, journalists, critiques facing the brunt of it for several decades. And soon after the Aragalaya, we saw protesters arrested, and this whole conversation restarted. Do we need a PTA? What's the purpose of the PTA? The broad pass. And I think many then realized it is actually a law that was brought in temporarily and become this kind of now normalized system of governance. And we've also seen over the last few years, several governments trying to bring in new replacements. We had the counter-terror bill that was brought in 2018, 2019, and the anti-terror bill that was brought in 2023, 2024. We've had conversations on this show as well. The more recent draft that came about was last year, a few days actually after the cyclone hit. We saw this, it's not a bill really because it hasn't been gazetted. So it's more kind of the government has said it's a consultation. They're going to have 2 months of, get comments. And at the outset, Niresh, I think it's very important to recognize that's a positive thing. Because a lot of the times we are looking at bills that have been gazetted and presented to Parliament, and we're rushing to challenge it. Now, there is a break to that cycle in that this government has said, okay, 2 months, you're going to get time to come in and comment on it. That's a positive. But a couple of things in terms of what has been made public is, the nature, at least from what we're looking at, it's so broad. It's 64 pages. In a situation where many are still facing difficulties, are they actually going to be able to look at this thoroughly and be able to comment? That's one. The other one is compared to the anti-terror bill that came out in 2023, 2024, there isn't major differences with this. I mean, the crux of it is the offenses, the definition of terrorism is very broad, very concerning in that how it can be implemented and used when it becomes a law. And I'm assuming it's when rather than if. But, that said, I'm just commenting on what's there. The other is the powers of the security apparatus. The military has powers to arrest. The Coast Guard has powers to arrest. The detention is there that's raised concerns. And then a massive concern is the powers of the executive in terms of being able to proscribe organizations indefinitely. Now, the anti-terror bill actually gave the power for 1 year to prescribe, which we found still problematic. Here, indefinitely. There's no court coming in. No one can appeal. The president can decide if they want to. Under this law, they could prescribe the MTV organization for however long they want to. So there are powers within the executive arm that are broad-ranging that can impact fundamental rights. So I hope that the 2 months the government has given for consultation is a time of constructive engagement, that they actually take note of the comments that come their way and improve this. But my concern again with this kind of law or proposal is, my main point was PTA became normalized. The security apparatus felt it was their right to have such broad powers. Broad powers that have led to, and the Human Rights Commission has documented, others have documented, entrenched torture, enforced disappearances. That became a culture in Sri Lanka. Now there is hope that that's the past and we can move forward. But the mentality is you need broad powers to arrest, detain, to investigate. And this draft speaks to that mentality with very limited checks in terms of protecting fundamental rights. So while there are some positives, there are concerns in terms of the drafting, in terms of the thinking behind this. And it will be good to hear from the government. Are they really going to take note of these concerns and improve this? And then how is that going to be done?
Right. Well, the government did give 2 months for the public and organizations such as yours to give their comments. And we had the Justice Minister, Honorable Harshananyakkara, was on this program last week, and he did categorically state that the views of the public which came in would be considered very seriously, but he did say that not every viewpoint can be included, obviously. There will be opposing viewpoints. Everyone will have their points of view. But he did say that that is the process. So,
which is a good thing. I think
absolutely.
that giving that time for consultation, we haven't seen that in recent years under the government. So at least that is happening is important. But I hope it's not a token time, saying we've given you 2 months, but we're still moving ahead. We'll raise concerns as to the genuineness of that. So, from what I've seen so far, there's a lot that needs to be addressed if the government is serious with what they said pre-election. And Niresh, I think many will remember the JVP and those linked with the NPP also were at the butt end of the PTA many years ago. But also with the counter-terror bill and the anti-terror bill, the members of the government, even cabinet members, have been part of the protest to say it shouldn't be. The PTA has no place in a democracy, but they even challenge these bills. As recent as 2024, there were members of this government who were with us in the Supreme Court challenging the anti-terror bill. So the question for me is, and many came for meetings and spoke against that bill, how is it that, now that they're in government, how is it that a similar draft is now being circulated by this government? So I would really like to hear from the government in that the next steps, but will they be open to having greater safeguards, tightening language in terms of the definition of the terrorism, the offenses, because I feel they're still broad, but making sure that there are checks on the powers of the executive. Arrest detention should be then having thorough oversight from the magistrate, from the judiciary. You still have administrative detention in this, where the magistrate has a very limited role. You have a very alarming provision of the prescription. Organizations can be prescribed, not just organizations, individuals that engage with an institution that's prescribed will be committing an offense. So, for example, MTV, if it's prescribed, me having a conversation with someone in MTV will be seen as an offense. So why is there such broad areas? If it's to, if it's national security, can we look at national security in a much more narrow sense and ensure that even those paths, there are very strong, robust checks in place so that it prevents abuse. Abuse in a country that has seen decades of torture, that is a known fact. The government is very aware of it. So a question though is, who is driving this process? Who will ultimately decide what gets into a draft bill that then gets gazetted? Now, I also will say the government and others will say, well, you can challenge it in the Supreme Court. You have that power. As someone who's engaged with that process, I will say the Supreme Court only has limited role in stopping a very broad law. They only look at the constitutionality of a bill. They can't decide on policy. The policy is with the government. The government will decide how broad a bill will be, how much power the executive arm gets. And this, compared to all the other drafts, compared to the PTA, is so broad. It raises many questions.
So let me directly ask you, do you feel that this draft needs a massive overhaul?
Yes. And again, I say this, having seen that and engaged with processes in the past, which try to bring in replacements to the PTA. This, I feel, is so problematic. You can't tinker with it. And Niresh, it goes back to a point we've discussed here, is that, when the online safety bill was proposed, we said you can't fix a fundamentally flawed bill. Withdraw the bill, withdraw the act, I still say withdraw the act and start afresh. Don't tinker with the problematic process. This, by taking a few things off, you're not going to fix this proposal. I think it should be, the question is, what is the objective of this? Okay, you want to repeal the PTA, but replace it with what? Not something that's worse than the PTA. We've had a war, we've had emergencies, but we also have existing laws. We have the penal code. We have the public security ordinance. Now, the emergency that we have at the moment has been declared under the public security ordinance, the PSO. So we have those laws. Those, I believe, still gives broad powers to the executive. So why do we then have such a broad, vague terminology with limited checks being brought in? And on what objective? You could have, and I think the international standards are that you can have laws, provisions to address terrorism that are clearly defined, that are precise. The more you keep it broad and vague, the potential for abuse is greater. And in a country such as Sri Lanka, which has seen abuse, which has an entrenched culture of abuse and torture, such a proposal is actually very scary as to how it will be implemented. And those who are at the butt end of it, I think, could speak to this much more in terms of the dangers of that.
Right. So clearly we need to look at not just the wording here, but the intent. And whenever any law is being drafted, the intent of those writing it is a key point, isn't it? Because you can take a law which has been passed and then you use it for something completely outside of what it was intended to be used for. The ICCPR Act, which has been abused time and time again in Sri Lanka, was actually meant to protect minorities, including religious and racial minorities. But in Sri Lanka, it worked the other way.
Yeah, I think the ICCPR is a good example of how that law has been used to target and weaponize against not just minorities, but, we've had comedians who've been targeted, who've had to face detention because of this broad law. Now, that's that's one example. But the PTA in itself, we've seen many people detained for decades who've been stuck in that system, who've been tortured to get confessions out. So that's the backdrop, that's our context, that's our reality. So any new law, and law reform is important, but law reform should be done properly. Now, with this, we had a committee that was appointed by the Justice Minister, composing of lawyers, of state officials. But, again, I think there are concerns as to having had so many drafting processes. Could they not have learned from the past? The counter-terror bill 2018 experience that when it went to the parliament, there were committee sessions where media, civil society could engage, and that process actually tightened language. That made even the government of the day realize, look, you have to have safeguards because of the abuse, the potential for abuse. Now, for example, the CTA draft, the detention period was for only 2 weeks. This is for 2 months. So, the government might say, well, the PTA gives you 3 months detention. Isn't this an improvement? But why are we using the PTA as the benchmark here? Shouldn't we be striving for something more?
Well, the PTA should not be the benchmark because it's an absurd law. I mean, we've been arguing this for decades, and very few people actually say that it is a sound law. In fact, I haven't heard anyone saying it. Governments have come and said, well, we needed a law to use, so we used the PTA, but no one said that the PTA is this wonderful law. So, you can't be looking at the PTA and deciding, okay, let's have a watered down PTA.
But that's my point at the very outset, Niresh, is that the PTA has become normalized. PTA is used...
Not in my mind, it hasn't.
Not in our minds, but I think, we may be the minority in some respects that we critique, we challenge these concepts. But I think when there is a security or emergency, I mean, if you remember 2019, the CTA, for example, the conversations were going on, and then the Easter Sunday attacks happened. And then suddenly the narrative changed. It was all about national security. Now, in that kind of mindset, your thinking is very much what broad paths can be given to investigate. But I think considering where Sri Lanka has come, especially in the last few years, especially what we've seen with the Aragalaya, is that this kind of yearning for a clean, better system of government and governance, which respects the rights of the people, which strengthens institutions like the judiciary, and there should be checks and balances. So any law, not just this, any law that is brought about needs to keep that in mind. It shouldn't be thinking about something that was introduced 4 decades ago, which is so outdated, which is draconian, which shouldn't be even in the discourse. But there is a segment of society who will still push that line. So I think it's so important these kind of conversations happen. There is attention from the media to say, there is time now. The government has at least recognized there has to be kind of conversation. Let's use that time in the most constructive way and make sure that these processes get fixed, but the outcome is also something that recognizes and respects the rights of all citizens.
Right. So we're almost out of time, but a couple more questions, Bhavani. One is, you alluded to the fact that the 2-month period given for the public to comment and to participate in the process of this particular act, this bill rather, is a wonderful thing, basically. But why can't we have this normalized for every bill which comes through? I mean, why should this be an exception? Can't we have this as the process where, any bill would get 2 months? Nothing would be rammed down the throats of 21 million Sri Lankans. Because we had a huge problem under the last regime, which basically subverted the process and hijacked the process and just rammed bills through. And, we here at Newsfirst seem to be the thin red line trying to hold these things back, bringing people like you onto our shows and arguing against it. And that was always the last days before it would get passed. And we were successful, but it shouldn't be like that.
Yes,
we need that 2 month space.
And I think that's kind of a good reminder that, we've just in the recent past, we've seen the Online Safety Act, there was such a limited time, and it was rushed through. People didn't understand what that meant. And shows like this actually try to get that message out. But lawmaking should be something where all citizens are part of. It shouldn't be something that is used to address certain needs of sections of government or sections of society. Now, that's why I welcome the fact that there's at least 2 months to discuss something that's not a bill that's gazetted. There is that time. And I hope this government sets it in place that all proposed laws go through that. And it's not just, making it public and saying 2 months, but there should be committees that have these conversations. Parliament can play a role. I mean, this is the kind of the whole point of democracy is you have these discussions, debates, and then decide what's the best course of action. And ideally, if they get constructive criticism, that should feed into that. It shouldn't be ignored because it's not convenient. So lawmaking should be transparent and inclusive and not rushed through, not because it's to check a box and say, okay, we've done it now and let's now, move to the other thing. Similarly, I think things like Online Safety Act, the government is talking about this. It's reported in the media that there's going to be amendments that are going to be brought in for addressing fake news. Now, my concern is, again, like the PTA and anti-terror, online safety bill, when it came about, this government was in opposition, and in Parliament and outside, they opposed, challenged it, saying this is not a piece of law that should be in the law books. So why are we talking about an amendment? Shouldn't we be talking about how do you do a good law to address things like misinformation, fake news? That's a big issue. I understand that. But it should be done properly. There should be consultation. The drafting should be transparent. It should be something people feel they own rather than feeling it's going to be used to weaponize and target them.
Right. My last question was going to be on the OSA, but you've answered it already, and I'm afraid we are out of time. My thanks to Bhavani Fonseka, Senior Researcher at the Center for Policy Alternatives. Lovely having you back here again.
Thank you, Niresh.
And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.
Step on the stage, rewrite your name.
The Voice Teens Walking Auditions.
Janawari 8
ගම්පහ නගර සභා පුස්තකාල ශ්‍රවණාගාරය
ජනවාරි 9
මීගමුව රුක්මනී දේවී මධ්‍යස්ථානය
ජනවාරි 10
හලාවත සුදසුන ශාලාව
ජනවාරි 13
මහනුවර KCC පරිශ්‍රය
ජනවාරි 14
කුරුණෑගල නගර ශාලාව
ජනවාරි 16
අනුරාධපුර නගර සභා ශ්‍රවණාගාරය
ජනවාරි 17
වවුනියාව නගර ශාලාව
ජනවාරි 19
මාතර සනස ශ්‍රවණාගාරය
ජනවාරි 20
මොනරාගල නගර සභා පුස්තකාල ශ්‍රවණාගාරය
ජනවාරි 21
අම්පාර තානායම පරිශ්‍රය
ජනවාරි 20